Great. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you all very much for joining us. I want to begin with a land acknowledgement here in Colorado. I acknowledge that the University of Colorado Boulder, where I sit right now, sits upon the land within the territories of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho peoples. Further, I acknowledge that 48 contemporary tribal nations are historically tied to the lands that make up what is currently the state of Colorado. Thank you for joining us from not just this area and not just this state, but around the country. We're excited about the national level panel that we've got planned, and followed then by the state level panel, talking about the future of hydraulic fracturing. Some initial logistics from here before we get going. We are going to have a live Q&A function that's available to everyone who's joining, so please feel free to submit your questions to the panelists there. We're going to start with a survey right now, and Michaela is going to trigger that in just a moment. Michaela is our Special Projects Director, so you should all see that in front of you. And as you answer that question, I also will warn you that at 2 o'clock when we start our state level panel, there'll be a second poll. And then as we finish up at the end, 2 o'clock Mountain Time, that is, as we finish up at the end of our 2-hour block, there will be a final survey that we'll ask you to complete. So give you just a minute there. And I'm not sure if you can see what I can see, but we've got nearly 2/3 joining us from Colorado, but a third is elsewhere across the country. So I'll leave it on for 5 more seconds. So please submit your response and then I'll finish the polling. Okay, just over 2/3 from the state of Colorado. So my name is Max Boykoff. I'm a professor in environmental studies. I'm also director of our program. I'm a fellow in the Cooperative Institute for Research in Environmental Sciences, and I'm co-leading this project with Matthew Druckenmiller, who you'll hear from in just a moment. I just want to say a few words about the local science engagement network that we have here in the state of Colorado and our efforts involved there. And Matt will also describe it a bit more and then talk about our event today in more detail. At the end of the event, we'll have some closing comments, and Special Projects Director Michaela Blanton, who I mentioned, will share some of our plans to sustain our work going forward. So our project, this Colorado Local Science Engagement Network, was established just about a year ago. We are one of 3 states that are funded through AAAS, and also with the state of Georgia and the state of Missouri. We have objectives that certainly intersect to first bring relevant and timely science to bear on policy decisions at the local, state, and national levels so that policies are better suited to address challenges relating to dimensions like climate change, sustainability, natural resource management. And then second, to build and foster a new contingent of scientists in the state of Colorado, in our case, who are strongly engaged in identifying opportunities and relationships for bringing science into the policy realm. So we specifically in the Cooperative Institute for Research in Environmental Sciences, or CIRES, where I am a fellow, have been partnering through this project with AAAS, which is the American Association for the Advancement of Science, to support these ongoing efforts. Today's event more specifically is sponsored by CIRES, by the Media and Climate Change Observatory at CU, and along with our friends at the Institute for Science and Policy at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. I also want to thank AAAS partners, the EPI-Center, the Center for Scientific Evidence in Public Issues, for their great work in helping us put this together. So I'm going to turn things over to Matt Druckenmiller to talk a little bit more about our efforts and then pivot into the event today. Over to you, Matt.
Thank you, Max. So my name, again, is Matthew Druckenmiller. I am a research scientist at the Cooperative Institute for Research in Environmental Sciences at the University of Colorado Boulder. and I am co-leading the Colorado Local Science Engagement Network with Max. To date, and over the last year, we have been developing 3 focus areas within the Local Science Engagement Network. And these are meant to signal our priorities, those that are tied to issues in Colorado, but also ones that have relevance beyond Colorado. And that's again why at this event we are talking about hydraulic fracturing both at the state level and at the national level. And we've also selected focus areas to be responsive to really current science policy issues and to active decision-making arenas. And these priority areas are going to be driving the activities of the network. So events like this, but also science notes that our network and our network partners will be writing on different topics. And some of those notes are very brief updates. Some are a bit more lengthy and detailed. And you can already on our website find some examples of the topics and the format that we're using for those. And maybe Michaela or Max or someone could post our website into the chat in case anyone wants to have that link on hand. In addition, we're hoping that these focus areas allow us to bring people together, to exchange knowledge. It may be events like this, but it might also be workshops that take shape with policymakers themselves. So the 3 areas are first, a focus on carbon-based and renewable energy. So that is the focus area which this event falls under. The second focus area is climate and environment. And the third being technology. And looking at where emerging technologies, for example, artificial technology or self-driving cars, for example, intersect with the policy dimensions and the active decisions that are being considered at different levels of governance. The last thing I'll say is that we really strive to be nonpartisan in how we approach these topics and invite people to the table from different backgrounds, different perspectives, to have a conversation that challenges how we as individuals have thought about these topics in the past. And that's really what we hope to accomplish today through this event on the future of hydraulic fracturing, both at the U.S. national level and at the level of the state of Colorado. So with that, I am going to launch us into our discussion for today. And I will start by introducing our moderator for the first panel. Our moderator today is Dr. Christine Wiedinmyer, who is the Associate Director for Science at the University of Colorado Boulder's Cooperative Institute for Research in Environmental Sciences. Dr. Wiedinmyer is a former scientist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research and holds a Bachelor of Science in Chemical Engineering from Tulane University and a PhD in Chemical Engineering from the University of Texas at Austin. Christine's research focuses on the identification and quantification of various sources and modeling of the transport and fate of emitted pollutants in the atmosphere, and is someone who will be an expert in understanding that the topic of our discussion today has multiple sides. So Christine, I will now pass it over to you to kick off this first panel today.
Thank you, Matt. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm not going to take any other time other than just say we have 3 internationally recognized panelists today to discuss this topic, and I'll let each of them introduce themselves for a few minutes and then we'll get right into the discussion. So our first panelist is Tom Murphy. He is the director of Penn State's Marcellus Center for Outreach and Research, and I'll let him introduce himself more and provide a few comments.
Okay, so the director of the Marcellus Center for Outreach and Research, our name implies that we do both, and I think that's really an important characteristic of the center. We do a lot of outreach, so some of the conversation that we're going to get into today, I think, is going to be tailored to that as well. So we can talk a little bit more about some of the things that we do in that regard. But we take a very holistic view of shale. So we're looking at it from both the above ground considerations and the above ground risk, as well as the deployment of technologies below ground and all the considerations in between. So things like governance and workforce and social license, which is a big issue with lots of different types of energy development, stakeholder engagement, of course. All those are things that we get into and are really a key part of the work that we do, regardless of where we're working, whether it's here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania or nationally across the US, or certainly in a lot of the global locations we find ourselves in as we're talking about shale development. So maybe I'll stop with that and not take any more time, Christine.
Thanks, Tom. And our next panelist today is Mark Zoback, who is the Benjamin M. Page Professor of Geophysics at Stanford University, the Director of the Stanford Natural Gas Initiative, and the Co-Director of the Stanford Center for Induced and Triggered Seismicity, and the Stanford Center for Carbon Storage and Senior Fellow in the Precourt Institute for Energy. So Mark, do you want to take the floor?
Thank you, Christine. Well, the hats I'm wearing, as described by Christine, pretty much describe who I am and what I do these days. We started the Natural Gas Initiative at Stanford about 6 years ago because of the obvious benefits of abundant natural gas for replacing coal and the resultant dramatic drop in CO2 emissions from electrical power generation in the US. And there are a lot of other issues related to natural gas. And we'll get into that here in a few minutes, both at a national and international scale. So I consider myself someone who works very closely with the oil and gas industry, but with a very strong commitment to decarbonization and environmental protection.
Thank you. And then our third panelist is Amy Pickle, who directs the state policy program at Duke University's Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions. So Amy, do you want to introduce yourself?
Thanks. And thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited about this topic and having this conversation today. So in general, I'm really interested in the places that the state and federal government have some conflict. So cooperative federalism, law and policy. So that means over my career, I've really focused on water issues, coastal management, oil and gas and electricity. And I came to oil and gas through serving as a decision maker and a policy maker on the North Carolina Mining and Energy Commission, which was a great intellectual experience because for those of you who actually follow the map of the resource, North Carolina, despite its very best efforts, has never shown up on the map as having any really truly economically developable oil and gas. And so this was all an exercise in developing a rule and regulatory framework to address an industry that was unlikely to come, even when we thought there was, a very small single-digit possibility. Coming off of that role, I've worked with the Aspen Institute, the Colorado Energy and Water Institute, and the National Academy of Sciences Roundtable on Unconventional Hydrocarbon Development, really focused on law, governance, policy. So the kinds of questions I've been focused on are things like, can we have productive conflict? If we're not going to have a resolution, how do we have productive conflict in a place where the political dimensions are really fraught with sort of peril and conversation and building that stakeholder network? What's the role of local government and state government in balancing out the benefits and burdens? How do they flow across jurisdictions? What role of private property? How does that play into the production of a public good? And ultimately, for me, across all the areas, what I'm really interested in is what is effective policy? How do we define it? How do we have a values-based conversation? How do we have inclusive stakeholder engagement that really gets at the crux of the issue and the crux of the problem that we're trying to solve? So with that, I'm happy to turn it back over to Christine and look forward to the conversation.
Great. Well, let's just get into it. I can start us off, and I'm also keeping an eye on the questions. So for those in the audience, feel free to post your questions in the Q&A. But let's get started. Why is hydraulic fracturing being so widely used today? And where does it take place in the US? And I'll just open it up to any of the panelists. There's only 3 of you, so hopefully we can manage this smoothly.
I'll take the first part. Hydraulic, what we call hydraulic fracturing today is really associated with horizontal drilling and using hydraulic fracturing multiple times along the horizontal length of a well. It started around 2005 with the specific goal of trying to produce natural gas from organic rich, clay rich rocks that had been known about forever. These are the traditional source rocks for hydrocarbons. But the idea was to actually produce from these extremely low permeability formations, originally in the Barnett Shale of the Dallas-Fort Worth metropolitan area. And it turned out to be extremely effective, and the rest is history. Tremendous quantities of natural gas have been produced. They're being used at low cost throughout the United States to great economic benefit. They're replacing coal as the primary source for electrical power generation. And the other application now of horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing has been in the sort of traditional oil and gas industry, which over the past 100 years discovered many uneconomic oil reservoirs. In other words, the oil is there, but you can't get it out easily. And so now what we're seeing is horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing applied to those reservoirs. So we're producing a lot of oil now as well as natural gas. So that's why it started. That's how it's evolved. And I'll let someone take the rest of the question about where it's happening and where the hot spots of activity are right now.
In terms of, maybe I'll jump in terms of where it's happening. The reality is, if you look across the country, anywhere that shale is being developed, and we could look up in the northern tier of the country, up in the Bakken, maybe up in North Dakota and Montana, certainly down through Texas and New Mexico, there in Colorado, where some of you are, and then to the Marcellus in the east and some of the other big shale fields. All those have the well stimulation process of hydraulic fracturing being used to produce the gas. Making a little bit of a distinction here, referring to hydraulic fracturing as a part of the overall process and not the process in total. So I think that it's important to recognize there's a lot of technologies that have come to bear to make this work. As Mark mentioned, the horizontal drilling, which some directional drilling has been going on for quite some time. But putting together a number of things, including policy and financial packages to make some of this happen, is really what brought all this to the forefront. That said, this is not just a U.S. type of scenario. Certainly not just there in Colorado or not just across the continental U.S., but also we see it in many places up in the western part of Canada, where shale is being developed. We also see it now in China. There's quite a bit that's occurring in the Vaca Muerta and the western part of Argentina. We see it in some other locations around the world where they're making some attempts, and it's just starting to gain a foothold with some pilot projects that are being done. Colombia would be a good example of that right now. So again, there's pretty much anywhere shale is being looked at as a potential resource to bring this gas resource or oil and gas resource to the market. Hydraulic fracturing is showing up in those locations and will continue to do so for the reasons that Mark mentioned. It's very effective.
Yeah, and Tom, you mentioned that there was changes in policy that enabled this type of activity to occur more often. Amy, do you have any comments on what policy changes happened to put that in place?
I'm challenged to figure out the point
Okay.
at which the policy changes have started or stopped,
Okay.
and the ongoing debate. I do want to emphasize a couple of things that both Mark and Tom said that I think are really important for us to keep in mind. The goal of high volume hydraulic fracturing is to get to these relatively low permeability resources, and the technology that most people in the media or the shorthand notation of hydraulic fracturing refers to a multi-stage process that is much more than just the fracturing process itself. So both the horizontal or directional drilling, as well as the perforation of the pipes and the development of those fractures to get the resources out, are sort of part and parcel of what we understand as hydraulic fracturing. And I think in terms of policy development, those nuances really get lost in the political discussion. And so when you ask about policy developments to enable or think through the impacts from and the benefits from fracturing, we really need to talk about all of the different social and economic benefits and burdens, where they sit, and then how are we accessing the resource in a way that is most technologically efficient, in a way that's also protective of those resources. And so the policy developments have lagged, as policy often does, where the technology actually is, and the political discourse is sometimes in a different sphere altogether, right? So none of those things follow the same time scale. So it's a hard question. That's a long way of saying it's a really hard question to answer, Christine.
And we'll probably get into
for all those
specifics. So yeah, maybe you all might want to comment on what are some of the trade-offs or cost and benefits associated with hydraulic fracturing?
Well, when horizontal drilling and multi-stage hydraulic fracturing began, it was an unconventional technology. It is now the conventional technology because it's so much more effective. You can imagine a sedimentary layer, let's just say it's 50 feet thick. You drill a vertical well through it, the old way of doing things, and all the hydrocarbons have to come into that well. Now you can drill a well in that 50-foot unit that's 5 to 10,000 feet long, and you can hydraulically fracture it 40 or 50 times. So the return for a given level of effort from a single well is that much more effective. So it is the way wells are being drilled now. I like to endorse what Amy said. The hydraulic fracturing process is just one step in a chain of events. And I know in the eyes of the public, hydraulic fracturing is synonymous with oil and gas development. It shouldn't be. But it is often singled out, and that's fine too. We can discuss it in both contexts.
I might highlight a couple of cost benefits. It's certainly not all of them, but one thing to think about is that one of the great benefits to surface impacts from both the horizontal drilling or the directional bore drilling and the high volume hydraulic fracturing is less surface use to get at more of the resource. So being able to go with longer and longer laterals as that technology has improved over time means that you have a smaller footprint to get more of the resource out of the rock. So that's a huge benefit, right, of this kind of technology, where you're able to go farther without disturbing the surface than if you think about a conventional reservoir or single well that's going to sit on the surface and try to access a more conventional capped resource. Another benefit that might want to emphasize is the way in which the technology has evolved is that we have a much better handle on what it takes to protect the surface resources. And so how we've been drilling over the years, when we think about protection of surface water, drinkable water, potable water, we have a better handle on how to do that safely within the formation. Most people, when they think about some of the burdens, they're really traditional environmental burdens that come from industrial processes. So air quality impacts, public health impacts from VOCs, often driven by diesel generators, surface impacts for erosion, stormwater, soil, water quality, particulate matter, these kinds of things that we would associate with industrial processes are the kinds of burdens that we're putting on the sort of immediate location. And the cost benefit that I want to emphasize there is, for much of the country, the estate is split. So the people who are living on the surface close to the well site may not be getting the benefit of the royalties that are coming from extracting the resource themselves. So there's often a mismatch for the public health or environmental burden, where that rests and where the money comes from or where the money goes. And that's something that from a policy standpoint has been really challenging to figure out how to address.
Oh.
Might add a couple things in there as well, just real quick. You know, we think about, we talk about the cost benefits, and Amy is alluding to the water side of this, which is something that we talk about quite a bit. There's a waste management issue here, and I think that's that environmental footprint, again, as Amy is referencing. But managing the different components of that waste is definitely been one of the bigger challenges as this process has moved forward. And we've seen a lot of evolution, both in policy, regulation, legislation, and certainly the deployment of technology to make that happen. So how to deal with the waters that are being produced, the waters that are being sourced and then produced through this process over time, and to clean them up and make them usable in some format going forward has certainly been one of the bigger challenges, but one that I think we've seen lots of advancement through recycling and reuse going forward. That said, it also generates other waste. So when you're cleaning up the water, then you're pulling something out. Often that is something along the lines of heavy metals and norm, and the biggest component would be brine. So how to deal with those components, how to possibly reuse those. And we have companies now that are looking that that water that had been considered a waste in the past should be considered a resource. It just has to be mined in itself to be used in other industrial processes or other processes that might be out there in the larger landscape. So I think that's been a big part of the discussion. We work in the renewable side as well, and the same conversation is there. You know, you can look at end of life for solar or wind turbines and see that, you know, there's a potential waste that's has to be dealt with at some point out there. And that's where technology has to come to bear and resolve some of these in a mining of those products so that we can re-extract some of the investment that we put into them with some of the minerals and metals and things of that nature. So I think those are going to be important. On the plus side, two things that I mentioned real quick that maybe we haven't covered. Low cost has given way to more use. And it can be argued as a good thing or a bad thing, but power, you know, from a power gen standpoint, and I think Mark mentioned in the beginning about lower emissions, so lower cost with natural gas has pushed more coal out of the picture. And we're seeing that happen not just here in the States, but also in other countries. South Africa, that's 90-some% coal powered, where a lot of industry is located, countries like Poland and Europe, and you know, we can keep going down a list like that are in the 90+% coal driven, are now moving largely to natural gas and renewables. So taking a lot of those emissions off. And a lot of that natural gas that they are or will be utilizing is coming from other locations, meaning coming from LNG that's being shipped from locations like the US or other countries. So there is some upside to be seen. Maybe it's not as direct of an upside, but you know, if we're talking about a climate metric, which is global, then we ought to be, you know, looking at that component of it as well. And thinking about that piece, maybe as a last comment, when we think about what has come out of this and the abundance of energy that has been produced, and again, there's an argument that, you know, that's a good thing or a bad thing, but one of the clear indicators is from a geopolitical level. It's changed the tables quite a bit in a variety of places around the world. A lot of countries that were energy import locations then were looking at this as an opportunity to develop their own resource, and that gives them a different seat at a different table, and also has reduced some of the price volatility across the world, which has made a difference with the US and some of the geopolitical objectives that we have here. So, you know, again, those are some things that maybe don't always come to the forefront when we just think about the below ground extraction or some of the more direct ramifications of it.
Thank you, Tom. And oh, Mark, were you going to comment?
Yeah, I wanted to add something to what Amy said and also Tom. This ability to drill multiple wells from one site goes by the name of pad drilling. You identify a location and you might drill. There are cases in which 20 wells have been drilled from exactly the same spot. So it reduces the environmental footprint. It localizes all the activity, and therefore it's much more easy to govern what, things going to the site, things going away from the site. And it's just better for everyone, and it's more efficient for industry. In places like West Texas, that's actually moved on now to what's called cube drilling, where you're drilling multiple wells from the same site and also at different depths. And so the efficiency, of course, benefits the companies. It appears as lower prices, but also reduces the overall impact, excuse me, on the environment and on the people who live in that area. Everything's not perfect. This split estate problem that Amy mentioned, the people who have to put up with the traffic and the noise and the difficulty are usually not the same people, or often not the same people who are achieving the royalties. So there's a real mismatch in who's paying the cost and who's receiving the benefit. But the other thing I wanted to say is related to the effectiveness of this technology in the context of being in an era of decarbonization, right? We are moving away from fossil fuels in every way possible. And the abundance of natural gas makes all sorts of things possible. It makes it possible to have a heavily renewable electrical power grid with natural gas as a backup. These natural gas liquids that Tom described, propane in shorthand for the public, they provide a thermal power, a source of thermal power to the developing world. 4 million people are dying every year due to indoor air pollution from burning sticks and burning dung. This is an important issue for tremendous numbers of people. And finally, the ability to produce oil from these traditionally uneconomic reservoirs puts the whole hydrocarbon business on a new footing when you look to, what is the end game? What's going to happen over the next few decades as we use less and less oil, which is, where we need to go. It means that the discussion of drilling in Anwar and other protected areas are simply absurd. There's no geopolitical conversation that you can say that, well, the United States has to drill in these formerly protected areas in order to have secure supplies of oil in the future. It's nonsense. We have so many areas where hydrocarbons are currently being developed that can continue to produce the hydrocarbons we need. And of course, we'll still be importing some, but we've cut our imports more than half due to the increase in domestic production. It just changes the conversation. So questions like, should we be hydraulically fracturing on federal lands? Well, you can argue that from multiple directions, but one thing is clear: we don't need to do that any longer. That argument of these precious resources, we have to assure domestic supply. There is ample domestic supply of both oil and natural gas to meet the country's needs, for the next few decades.
Thanks, Mark. I'm actually going to pop back to something that Tom had mentioned earlier about the handling the waste and the wastewater. And this is a question that came from the audience. And if there's any incentives for the industry to better handle the waste and the wastewater. For example, this person wrote, I have heard that recycling produced water is very expensive, and thus there's little economic incentive for the industry to pursue that. I don't know if any of you wanted to comment on that.
So I'll take a first stab, and then I'd love to hear what Tom and Mark have to say. This is an issue that has been part of the debate for this resource or this technology from the very beginning. So produced water, what do you do with the volumes? And it is driven in part by the challenges, both policy and economic, of recycling. Some of those policy challenges are, if you are, let's take Texas as an example, you're a rancher in Texas, you might want to lease your minerals and lease your water rights to the company, right? So you want them to pay you for both the water that they use. You want to sell them both water, and you want to sell them the right to come in and capture the hydrocarbons that are underneath your land. So there are reasons that fresh water might be used that are economic and good for the private property owner. There are also problems with, or sort of economic problems or business confidentiality problems with recycling across companies. So companies may or may not be comfortable taking recycled water that's not purely wholly recycled to use in their operations, because there's a big business in the special sauce to maximize the extraction of the hydrocarbons, and that special sauce and that hydraulic fracturing fluid is proprietary and rests with the engineers who make that sales pitch and make that special sauce. So there are logistical problems in getting volumes of water that are appropriate of quality and sort of composition for recycling. So in areas where there is lots of water, there's less of an issue around the water, the ability to get that water to use in the hydraulic fracturing process. You may have a problem with disposal. So once that water comes back, you can either dispose of it or you can recycle it. There are lots of research, and you've got some of the best folks in the business to talk about what happens when you put it back underground with induced seismicity. And there are problems with treating it to be put and to be reused. The place to look to see how this is going to play out from a policy perspective is the Permian, because what's happening in Texas and New Mexico around produced water, I think, is going to set the stage because it's driven by both water scarcity and a tremendous amount of activity and a lot of water coming back up. So there's lots of questions and some really interesting maneuvering around who's going to regulate it in Texas between the Railroad Commission and Texas CEQ. So we'll sort of see where that ends up ultimately in the policy realm.
Mm-hmm. Thank
I'll
you.
make just a real quick comment, again, kind of play off of some things that Amy said there. As we saw the development of shale gas, mainly in the Marcellus as a case study here, as an example, water was typically run through industrial or municipal sewer treatment plants. And in the beginning, that there was some logic to that, maybe, I'm not sure from an environmental standpoint, but from a volumetric standpoint, it made sense maybe to do that. Very quickly, there was a realization that that was not going to work with the increasing volumes that were being generated. And a new system was put in place, partly through the realization from industry that they needed to do something, and certainly from a regulatory standpoint. So both of those things converged, moved that forward, and that really then is what kicked off the recycling. What companies will clearly say is that they save a considerable amount of dollars on a per well basis. And I've seen numbers of upwards of $200,000 in reusing and recycling the water versus using the water one time. And one of the things that they very quickly found out was that the quality of the water did not have to be as pristine as they had thought it needed to be in the very beginning. So some of the chemicals that we're using downhole during the hydraulic fracturing process, there was modifications made to those. Again, the secret sauce that Amy mentioned, some tweaking of that, quite a bit of tweaking of that to come up with something that was more palatable to them for what they were trying to do in that engineered process. So that has largely then driven the industry from a cost basis, and also just from the value of reusing that. And there's even a public relations component of that, of course, and reusing that instead of moving that around great distances, and a whole series of ways that that's being done. Some on site, some at centralized locations, and others in a variety of other ways. And then with a final disposal of those fluids that they can't, once they get to a point that they cannot continue to be reused, then a underground disposal process that has been put in place and has been expanded during this overall process. So a number of steps are there, but now what we're seeing, again, using Marcellus, which is a very large play, is you're looking at north of 80% of the fluids are being recycled. So I think it's a testament to the capacity of the engineering to make a better process, driven by marketing, driven by economics, and certainly driven by regulation as well.
Thank you, Tom. I'm going to pop to one question from the audience again, which says, as we move towards a low carbon energy future, what happens to the no longer needed fossil fuel infrastructure, and who will be responsible for properly maintaining and retiring oil and gas wells that are no longer productive? So is there any thought about looking into the future and as we transition away?
Yeah, I'll take a
So-
first stab at it. And again, I'm going to come back to Pennsylvania, where a lot of this started. I'm sitting in Pennsylvania, but it's considered the birthplace of oil and gas development. There are some that dispute that, but we won't go into that. But the reality is that we have hundreds of thousands of wells, shallow conventional wells that were drilled, 100 some years ago, and upwards of just even a few decades ago, back into the 40s maybe, that the people don't know where they are right now. So abandoned, and companies that are no longer there. Now, that said, you also didn't have a regulatory process or regulatory agency. Again, if you just look at one state, but this is very similar in a lot of states, that was not regulating that, was not controlling that, was not mapping those wells, and that's really created a problem. That said, those are shallow, low producing wells. They're still problematic, but it's not the same as a shale well. Now, once it's moved into high gear with these high producing shale wells, which are much deeper, again, lots more volume. Now there is a process in place, there is bonding in place, which Christine, I think, is the answer to the question. So it's regulatory as well as bonding requirements to make sure that that infrastructure is dealt with at end of life of the technology. I don't know that that's foolproof, and I certainly wouldn't say that here. And there are concerns because you have companies that come in, the initial company that comes in and does the drilling in the first part of the production, and then sells those same wells off to somebody else in a consolidated fashion, that then may sell them to another company that might not have the depth of pocket and now has a lot more wells to put to bed at the end, to abandon and make sure that that part is done right. So there is a growing concern, even within the regulatory community, to make sure that that part is addressed and possibly not allow that third player, or whatever number they are at that point in time, to consolidate that many if they don't have the wherewithal, the financial wherewithal, and the bonding capacity to be able to care for that technology at the final end of its life.
Thanks, Tom. Go
So-
ahead, Amy.
I was going to say, I have to chime in on financial assurance because, for one thing, it is very much on Coloradans' minds, and I think it's going to be the one of the places that the rulemaking goes next. But also because I want to highlight a couple of things that Tom said. One is that I think it's important to segment out the legacy well problem, and that, if for many states, also encompasses conventional, or we used to think of as conventional vertical drilling. So there is a legacy problem in many states that is that nobody really has a good handle on the scope and scale. So how do we deal with these legacy wells is a part of the problem. The second part of the problem is for these high volume hydraulically fractured wells, what is the appropriate mechanism for ensuring full plugging and abandonment of these wells, where you may or may not have a financially responsible operator at the point that you want to plug and abandon it. Bonding is a way that most states have done it. We can look at other environmental challenges where states have set up trust funds. I will say from experience that those, generally speaking, are bankrupt from the second they get started. The amount of money in those trust funds, if you look at leaking underground storage tanks as a really good example, most states have not been able to get a handle on their underground gasoline storage, let alone a problem for states that have the scope and scale of the drilling that they've seen. So getting that lined up, the amount of money you need to be able to anticipate the plugging and abandonment needs. And the cost of plugging and abandoning a well changes as technology changes. So there's sort of a mismatch in how much money do you need, are you likely to need it, and can you get it from another source, or how much money is available within the industry in order to feed either the bonding or the trust fund mechanism. So figuring out that policy mechanism to address both of those components, I don't know that anybody's figured out quite right yet. So it's worth a healthy conversation.
Thanks, Amy. I wanted to hop into just how might the change of administration and President Biden's priorities affect oil and gas development in the U.S.? We are seeing big changes and big talk. So can you comment on the new administration, some of the policies that may impact the industry?
Well, there, you know, a ban on development on federal land has been announced, and so that speaks volumes. And in the context of what I mentioned before, so be it. I don't find that troubling at all. There is a jurisdictional issue that's not often recognized. Amy should really speak to this, but you know, the federal government regulates operations on federal land, and on private land, which is where most of the development is, this is regulated on a state-by-state basis. And so what you find is states like Pennsylvania, who really got in this early and did a good job of building a regulatory structure and having good regulations and good enforcement, are adjacent to states like West Virginia, which is sort of the other end of the spectrum. And so part of the problem is how heterogeneous the governmental system is in protecting the public interest. And this is a constant battle, and it's waged on a state-by-state basis because it's the states that have jurisdiction on private land, which is where most is. So federal policy is going to be extremely important. I'm hoping the federal government follows California in establishing incentives for low carbon fuel standards. You know, transportation is a huge source of CO2 and a real battleground. In California, there's you know, a tremendous move toward electric vehicles, which is subsidized in part by this low carbon fuel standard. If that were a federal law, you'd see this happening around the country. And you're seeing it in Europe now. You'll see another China in some areas. And I think there will be other federal policies that follow, but they have a limited impact because of this jurisdictional issue.
Thank you, Mark. I don't know if anyone else wants to comment here. We have a lot of questions in the chat, but I did want to hit also one thing before we get too much further. We are part of this Colorado Local Science Engagement Network. So I was wondering if you might be able to comment on how can we bring scientific evidence to bear on community concerns and policy considerations? How can we, you know, where has scientific evidence already played a role in the policy making associated with this industry and these activities?
So, I mean, I might start, and then I know that Tom does a lot of work in this area too. You know, there are a number of what the literature calls bridging organizations that are out there, folks whose job it is, and I work at one, my job is to think about the science and bring that to decision makers in a way to help with having more effective, more robust decision making. I'll say that, you know, there's a real challenge in matching the science and the scientific process to a decision maker and a decision maker process. So I'll share an anecdote from my time on the commission. We were debating setbacks, and one of my fellow commissioners, whom I adore, but we might sit on the different sides of the political spectrum, he and I have a fabulous relationship. He just was banging the table. Show me the peer-reviewed study that gives me the blast radius distance for an out-of-control well. And Jim, I adore you. There isn't one, and we have to make a decision as policymakers. What's the right policy for the setback? And that may or may not be the information that's directly available from the scientific record or from the record that's in front of us for the rulemaking. So these mismatches are really hard to navigate. the policymaker's job is to set policy that is informed by science. It may not weigh out the evidence that's in front of them in the way that the scientific community would prefer, or the way that they read their own science. And that mismatch, I think, creates a little bit of frustration on all sides on how do we use science in the decision-making process. So we need to get better at it, is the short answer. For the policymakers need to get better at it, and the scientists need to have effective bridging organizations to help them channel that information in an efficient way to the decision makers.
Christine, I would also weigh in maybe a couple of different angles there that might have some value. We put together, or I should say I was a part of putting together a program just 2 years ago called Pennsylvania Energy Horizons, and participated with a number of other people. There were about 50 of us from across Pennsylvania, looking at where energy would be going, or energy policy would be going potentially out through the year 2040. People have very different mindsets and how they felt about energy, coming from all different walks of life. And what we developed in the end were 3 different energy scenarios, looking at how this might look again as you step down, and what would it take to push one or the other of those, or the third of those scenarios, into motion. And we came up with a variety of different disruptive components, politically or social or technology, financial, all those different things. So we looked at a lot of the science, as Amy is talking about, that would feed into or generate where those different scenarios might go, and then what policy potentially, all that would lead then to policy that could be generated around that going forward. Then it was a great exercise, to your point about how can you get people involved. This was a great way to get a lot of different people involved and bring a wide variety of different perspectives to the table. So, social sciences and, some of the environmental sciences and legal and other hard sciences, all those different components at the table to then generate these different scenarios that then would hopefully lead to some policies. So I think that was just an example I'd like to cite. And we have a website. If there's somebody who would like to do a follow-up, we'd be glad to highlight that. The second one that I want to mention is a program that we have that's referred to as by its acronym of TOPCOR, and I'll just go by the acronym. TOPCOR is a program, something we had put together with Colorado School of Mines and University of Texas at Austin, and we train regulators from, we've trained 34 different states, regulators, environmental regulators from 34 different states around the country, 4 or 5 Canadian provinces, and now we're working on some international connections. What that's intended to do is to bring them up to these regulators that have not a lot of tenure in their position, but bring them up to speed on the different technologies, help them make better decisions in the process they're doing. So it's an online, in-class, in-field type of a process setting that takes place over several years to go through the complete training. And we find it's very good for then developing regulators, technicians mainly, that are going in the field, doing inspections, and then building additional capacity within their respective agencies, which then often leads to policy development because of what they're sharing from one state to another by coming together and meeting and learning collectively in that sort of a fashion. So it's kind of an indirect pathway to policy, which I think is something that's worth highlighting, but we're finding it's very, very effective in terms of, number one, their credibility when they're in the field, and number two, their credibility between them and their peers, and then again, the policy that might be generated as a residual from that. So anyway, 2 options.
Yes, thanks, Tom. And I put the link for your Pennsylvania Energy Horizons and for all the panelists, because I think that's a really great and unique way of thinking about things.
It's an excellent program that we went through. I highly recommend people take a look in there and see what's there.
Yeah, and it's an issue that doesn't have one straightforward answer by any means. So There's one more question I just wanted to get to. We're coming to close to the top of the hour, but from the audience, it just said the term fracking is used very loosely, but in fact, it encompasses a lot of different approaches. And can you just discuss what the different approaches are? And there was some comment of this, and then where they are typically applied across the country. And we've hit on some of this in earlier discussions, but maybe there's more there to help answer that.
I'll take a shot at this. I think the local geologic land access, environmental constraints do have an imprint on exactly what's done in one area. The issue of water came up before. In some places, water is scarce and disposal is easy. In some places, water is abundant to use in the fracking process, but the disposal is difficult, and you have to recycle the water at greater cost. So things change from place to place, but the standard technology that's being used is not so different. You're drilling horizontally. The length of the wells depends on geologic and economic factors. You install steel casing, you cement it into place. And then after you do that, then that's of course in the targeted zone where the hydrocarbon exists. And after you do that, if you imagine the well kind of has a cross-sectional shape that looks a little bit like a foot, it's vertical like a leg, and then at the heel it bends and goes horizontally. So there's the toe of the well, the most distant part, and the heel of the well close to the vertical part. And you start near the toe and you start hydraulically fracturing section by section independently back toward the heel. And you might, when all this started 15 years ago, people would do 1 or 2 hydraulic fractures, and now they do 40 or 50 commonly in this one well. Okay. Now you're drilling several wells parallel to each other at a given place from one of these pads that we discussed before. And so what will happen is a drill rig and all the equipment will move in, but it won't drill one well, it'll drill many wells before that equipment has to be moved out again, which again is decreasing its footprint. Those wells are left with the steel casing and the cement, and they just sit there. And then a hydraulic fracturing crew comes in, and those wells will all be hydraulically fractured by moving from well to well. As one well is being hydraulically fractured, the next well is being prepared for hydraulic fracturing. And that process from toe to heel happens in each well, but not necessarily in that sequence. The operators are moving around. So all the hydraulic fracturing happens over a very short period of time. So it's pretty invasive, it's loud and it's noisy and equipment moves in, but it's localized both in time and space in a way that minimizes its impact. So these are, it's more efficient and it's less impactful, and that's good. But this general process, the amount of fluid and the amount of sand and the kind of fluid, that changes from place to place. But that hydraulic fracturing from toe to heel in an individual well, if not in a single sequence, is the basic technique that's used almost everywhere.
Thank you, Mark. And unfortunately, I think our time is up. I have like 20 million more questions. So I really want to thank the three of you for sharing your expertise and input and taking the time to talk to the audience here and to me today. And we're going to move it on. I'll hand it back to Max. I'm looking forward to the discussion specifically about Colorado issues. So thank you all.
Great. Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
Christine. Thank you very much, Amy, Mark, and Tom. Yes, I think we're just getting started. Many great topics there. Great discussion. We are going to turn to our next panel, though, right now, and that's the Colorado level discussion. And so I'd just like to introduce our moderator, our discussant, Suzanne Tegen, and then let her take things away. So a few words about Suzanne. She's currently the Assistant Director of the Center for a New Energy Economy at Colorado State University with expertise in energy economics and policy. She earned her PhD in energy policy from here at the University of Colorado Boulder. Her current work includes research on equitable transitions from coal power. She arrived at the Center for a New Energy Economy after working at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, or NREL, where she spent 14 years as an energy analyst as a researcher and a manager of the Technology Engineering and Deployment Group for Wind and Water Power. There's so much more that I could say about Suzanne, but I'll finish by saying that she's also a founding member of Women of Renewable Industries and Sustainable Energy, where she served on their executive committee for 9 years. Thanks so much, Suzanne. Over to you.
Thanks, Max, and hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here to talk about this topic specifically to Colorado. It's really helpful to have the context, I think, of the nationwide hydraulic fracturing conversation and then zero in on Colorado policy, technology, and people, our communities. And to do that, we have three great panelists today. The first is Julie Murphy, and I'm guessing she will talk to us about where she works at the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, which we will refer to as the COGCC. And this is, just one of many industries that plays alphabet soup. So I'm hoping she'll also talk a little bit about the COGCC as well as the Air Quality Control Commission, the AQCC, and some recent policy happenings in Colorado that are really important. So Julie was appointed as the director of Colorado's Oil and Gas Conservation Commission last July from her position as chief of staff and senior policy advisor. Her strong oil and gas regulatory experience draws from 7 years of service with the Colorado Department of Natural Resources. And prior to her appointment in 2020, she served as the COGCC's director and the Hearings and Regulatory Affairs Manager, and was an Assistant Attorney General representing the Commission and Division of Reclamation, Mining, and Safety. In the private sector, she spent 5 years representing clients in land use, natural resources, private property, and environmental disputes. And she's got her Bachelor's of Science in Wildlife Biology from Kansas State University and a Master's of Earth and Environmental Resources Management and JD from the University of South Carolina, as well as a Master's of Environmental Law from Vermont Law School. So as you can hear, she is highly qualified to tell us about Colorado's current and future hydraulic fracturing conversation. And the way we're going to work this is that Julie and Bruce Barker and Dan Caffeine are all going to give about a 10-minute kind of introductory presentation, and then we'll do Q&A just like the last panel did. So I think we'll jump right into Julie's presentation, and then I'll introduce the other panelists. So go ahead, Julie.
Great, thanks so much for your kind words and the opportunity. And as always, I look forward to engaging on this topic. So I'm the director of the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, and a couple of things for folks who aren't familiar with conservation commissions. Conservation and the title of our agency is about the responsible production of oil and gas in an efficient way. It's not the way we often think about conservation in terms of public spaces or public lands. So that's an important distinction. I can talk at a high level about the Air Quality Control Commission, but as far as I can tell, they regulate something that I barely understand, which is air emissions. And I'm so grateful for their expertise because it means I get to focus on what COGCC's mission is now, which is regulating oil and gas development in Colorado in a manner that's protective of public health, safety, welfare, and the environment. As I hear a lot about the national conversation, I think one of the things that really distinguishes oil and gas development in Colorado over the last decade is that our fastest growing urban centers is co-located with the most robust oil and gas development. And so I think because of that intersection, Colorado has had a unique perspective, opportunity, and maybe impetuous for change and in involvement of our regulatory sphere. And as a result of, as far as I can tell, as a result of those two competing factors, and also an increasing interest in looking at how we source our energy, where we source our energy, and how energy sourced within a particular jurisdiction is developed. Colorado has been through sweeping changes of its regulatory scheme for oil and gas. I think one of the groundbreaking changes happened in 2008 when the commission was kind of upended. And then most recently in 2019 with Senate Bill 19181. So I'll probably talk a lot about 19181, or if I say 181, I mean this landmark legislation from almost 2 years ago. I think the subtle change that it made that has deep impacts is changing the mission from fostering to regulate. Colorado, like many other oil and gas producing states, created these conservation commissions to make sure that oil and gas was developed responsibly, efficiently, and without waste. And there's a component of making sure that also the oil or gas got out of the ground. And so Colorado has actually taken the step to say, no, your job is no longer to foster oil and gas development, it's to really regulate it. It also transitioned our decision-making board from a volunteer structure. So I would guess that in the time that Amy Pickle spent on the North Carolina corollary for mining was in a volunteer capacity, coming in, making decisions, and then going back to a day job. And that's how Colorado's Oil and Gas Conservation Commission has been overseen for most of its time. Starting July 1st, we now have 5 full-time commission members who are day in, day out, paid to regulate oil and gas development. And so with that decision-making structure and the change from foster to regulate, in addition to a number of other pieces of the legislation, came this opportunity to wholesale rewrite COGCC's rules. We have just completed the majority of that undertaking. We adopted new rules that really reorganized, rewrote, and brought our regulations into conformity with current technological practices on November 23rd. Those rules became effective on January 15th. And I think actually today is the deadline for anybody filing a facial challenge to those rules. And so I'm hoping to have a cocktail tonight celebrating that we didn't do that. And I think that the reason that we did not get those lawsuits, as far as I know, is because of the amount of stakeholder engagement that we poured into this process. And that to me ties together a number of these pieces. How does science come in? How does science shape policy? How do the public's expectations shape how an organization makes decisions? And that to me is really framed by this transition to a professional commission. Another component that really has been instrumental in the changes that we've enacted are increased access to for public participation, easier standing to participate, more transparency around how to get there. Colorado continues to get lots of criticism for our website because it's hard to navigate if you don't understand oil and gas, and I acknowledge that challenge. At the same time, we have one of the best resources and databases available to scientists trying to understand what development is taking place. So it's really been a very vibrant 7 or 8 years that I've spent working in and around the commission. I may jump into a little bit of the increased protections that came out of 181 and the mission change rulemaking. And the mission change rulemaking is what we thought about as an organization when we thought, what is this change from foster to regulate, and how do we kind of take a thumb off the scales in favor of development and instead look at kind of the objective proposal put forward by an operator and make sure that it complies with the regulatory requirements that Colorado has adopted. So we've changed the permitting process in some ways to make sure that on the front end, our commissioners are looking at the surface development in concert with the subsurface development to better inform, where should a pad go. And again, if you think about the layout in Colorado, we have this increasingly urbanizing corridor that overlaps with the oil and gas development. And so understanding where a location is proposed when you're talking about, a 20-30 well pad is particularly important because you do gain huge efficiencies using horizontal well bores and hydraulic fracturing in terms of getting the resources out. But as I've started to think about it, it gets so efficient that you're also concentrating the impacts. And I can't remember the exact verbiage that Mark used to describe that, but it's very accurate, right? Like we're disturbing less surface, but where we are creating disturbance, it's increasing in its impactfulness. And so we wanted to be able to look at what was being proposed in the subsurface and how that influences the surface and what the best location is for a particular pad, for example. We also have really established a new regulatory relationship with local governments. 181 provided much broader authority for local governments to regulate oil and gas. That intersection and the role of the local government has been integral to Colorado's conversation about regulating oil and gas since at least 1993, and very publicly in 2013, the issue came to the head. I'm also incredibly proud to say that our new rules have elevated for the first time in our agency's experience and considerations of environmental justice by specifically considering disproportionately impacted communities as part of a permitting conversation. We need to understand the community into which a proposed oil and gas location is being considered. We are also creating a first of kind cumulative impacts data repository, trying to gather the information that, again, as it's aggregated across time, will provide, I think, very interesting insights for many scientifically minded folks to consider and shape and understand what oil and gas development looks like, both on the ground and in the air. We also established setbacks and siting requirements for oil and gas locations. We ended routine venting and flaring, and that might be the extent of my conversation about the Air Quality Control Commission, but this is an interesting intersection of authority where, you know, COGCC is looking at release of natural gas that could be sold as through, it's historically been handled through either venting it or flaring it. But from our perspective, it's a waste of resources. If you can develop it and you can sell it, we want to keep it in a pipe. And I think that's the mission in my mind in Colorado. We also adopted increased protections for both wildlife and water resources. That's kind of what we've done. Where we're going next, we need to consider financial assurances. Amy talked about that in great detail and with more depth than I'm going to today. We also need to adopt worker safety regulations that are separate and apart from, or sorry, not worker safety, worker certifications, and also permit fees. And so those are the 3 upcoming rulemakings. And thank you, Suzanne, for sending that overview out. And I think kind of coming back to this big picture place of policy and science and people, we as an organization could not have rewritten our rules without incredible support across incredibly diverse stakeholders in Colorado. We had 90 parties to the rulemaking. The rulemaking spanned 3 to 4 months of just hearing time. But when you talk about when did we start these conversations to rewrite our rules, they started in November, really on paper in November of 2019, and we wrapped up in November of 2020. And that is a year-long engagement from industry, from environmental NGOs, from local communities, from local governments, really across the state of Colorado. People poured themselves into this process. And as a result, we came out with rules that are also better written, better organized, and actually speak to the development technologies that are in use today. And so it's been a really incredible partnership and collaboration. We're still working out a lot of the kinks. Again, those rules have been in effect for about 35 days now. But I'm proud of the work, and I think that Colorado can be proud of the work that they've put into this and come out of it. I, of course, cannot express enough gratitude to the staff members from COGCC who also shared their expertise in what we've learned in this process. And a number of our folks have been through the Top Core training that Tom spoke about. I think that is a great resource, and how we all build this back together is just an important and ongoing conversation. And the other piece that's true is the industry evolves. Engineers engineer, it's what they're so incredibly good at. And so how do we continue to match that expertise and development? And so this has been a monumental moment, but it's certainly not the end of change in this industry, or I think in the regulatory environment in Colorado. I'm sure I'm either close to time or out of time, or I talked really quickly because I get nervous still. But with that, Suzanne, I'll turn it back to you and look forward to engaging the rest of the panelists.
Great, thank you so much. That was great, Julie. We will move now to Bruce Barker. He's our second Colorado panelist, and he is the Weld County Attorney. He was appointed to be Weld County Attorney in 1993, and before that was Assistant Weld County Attorney. He received his bachelor's degree in business and finance and his law degree from the University of Colorado. And Bruce has served and continues to be involved in his community, serving on the Greeley Transitional House Board of Directors, as president of the Centennial Rotary Club, and as president of the Windsor High School football team's Parent Booster Club. He's also president, secretary, and treasurer of the Colorado County Attorneys Association, and he will bring this to a local level for us, which I think is really important. We'll hear a little bit about economic impacts to Weld County, and then also hear about the community and the people of Weld County and how oil and gas impacts them. So Bruce, over to you.
Thank you, Suzanne. Appreciate the opportunity to speak to all of you. And I first just want to start off with kudos to Julie and her staff. They did not only a fantastic job on the rulemaking that the state had beginning in August and going through November, I believe it was, but also after that, they've put together a whole series of guidelines and different documents for operators to be able to work through permitting. A lot of videos, which actually are somewhat interesting to watch. I've watched them all and really appreciate them, but they've done just a fantastic job. So sort of dovetailing into a little bit of what Julie talked about, it was Senate Bill 181 was sort of a big deal in Colorado. And what it did was, from our perspective, as Julie mentioned, it gave greater land use authority to local governments, which Weld County sort of pounced on. We wanted to start our own permitting system, which we did just shortly after the state statute went into effect in April of 2019. For those of you who don't know where Weld County is, it's a pretty large county. We have about 4,000 square miles. We're located north and a little bit east from Denver. We border both the state of Wyoming and also the state of Nebraska. In Weld County, oil and gas is a big deal. The number one industry, however, is still agriculture. Number two industry is going to be oil and gas production. So it's a big industry in Weld County. We're currently, last year we produced 128 million barrels of oil, 150 million barrels of oil equivalent in gas. So the total in terms of the state production, we were 87% of the state production in oil and then 43% of the state production in gas. So as you can probably tell, our economy is heavily dependent upon the oil and gas industry. About 60% of our tax revenue that comes into the county government is both from ad valorem taxes on the oil and gas that is produced, but also in severance tax revenues that we receive from the state of Colorado. So there's a big dependence upon oil and gas production in the county for generating those tax revenues. For our economy, we have about 13,000 citizens of Weld County who are employed in the oil and gas industry. In 2017, that amounted to about $1.1 billion worth of income coming in. Of course, that's spent in a lot of different ways in Weld County, in restaurants and grocery stores and all sorts of different other businesses. So it has a great economic benefit to Weld County. So there's a desire to have oil and gas continue. And so as I mentioned, we got into our permitting in really August of 2019. One of the things that we saw as being areas that we could really concentrate on was those things that deal with being good neighbors to the people around where that location is going to be situated. Specifically, we were looking for the main complaints that we get include traffic. That's number one. Number two is noise. Number three is dust. It's coming off those facilities. And number four is lighting. Lighting that is typically, it happens during the pre-production phases where they're either doing the drilling, fracking, or the completion of the wells. And so they work at night a lot. So lighting is a big deal. Those are things that we wanted to be able to address. We also wanted to be able to address drainage, stormwater drainage, areas that are within the floodplain, so that there's a need to get a flood hazard development permit. Also, we wanted to make certain that if there is some use of the roadways that by heavy traffic coming into the facilities, that they actually, those companies are obligated to make certain that they pay for any improvements and any maintenance that is caused by those companies specific to their locations. And so we have improvements agreements and maintenance agreements that we get with the companies. What we have found is that the companies, and we meet with them about once a month, talking about what areas of the county they're going to be working in. Each company is real good about stepping up and making whatever repairs they need to our roadways. We give them right-of-way permits to work there. They do that voluntarily. They don't ask for any remuneration or any cost being paid to them. So we really appreciate that. So our permitting, one of the things that is highly important is that we have a hearing before a hearing officer. And that hearing officer, we have notices that go out. We're now going out to 2,000 feet to notice people in, asking them if they have concerns, wanting our operators who are applying for our permits to go out and meet with those people, and then to allow them the opportunity to participate in the hearing itself and take into consideration their concerns. That leads to the main part of the process, which is an alternative location analysis to get the best location that is going to have the minimal, the least impactful on the neighbors. And so we do that. We're also looking at cumulative impacts of various industries and also other oil and gas facilities around in the neighborhood. So as a result, we come up with a product or a location or siting that we feel meets all of those objectives, with the main one being to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the citizens of Weld County, of our environment, and also of the wildlife that is in the county. One of the things that I just wanted to mention is there are federal lands in Weld County, but very few. We have about 8% of our lands are covered by federal properties. So the majority of oil and gas activity is on private properties. There are a few on some of those federal lands, but most of the federal lands can be accessed via locations on private properties. One other thing that came up in the past hour was about water used in fracking. A recent study was in August of 2017, showed that about 2.5% of the water that is comes into Weld County, mainly through the South Platte Basin, from the Poudre River, or brought over from the West Slope, is used in fracking. In comparison, about 87% of the water that comes into the county is used for agriculture, and about 7 or 8% is used for municipal use. So the use of the water, the amount of water that is used in fracking is somewhat on the low side, in fact, very low in terms of the overall use. There was also a question about produced water, and in Weld County, we do have some wells or injection wells. I just checked with 2 of our operators while I was waiting to come on, and they both say that although one of those did have a pilot project for doing some recycling, what they found was that is not economical, and it does not appear to be one that they're going to want to pursue. So those operators say that it's their understanding that everyone is using injection wells to get rid of the produced water. And then lastly, I just wanted to mention about methane and VOCs. Yesterday we had at the Air Quality Control Commission, which Weld County participated in, it was a sort of a groundbreaking deal for what are known as pneumatic controllers at well sites and compressor stations, where those are typically where that methane release comes from. And so we participated in that. There was an industry-wide compromise with the Environmental Defense Fund, some other NGOs that came up with some real good compromise language, phasing out of those high emitting pneumatic controllers, which I think everyone feels good about. The industry says they can do it. And so we fully support that. Last thing I wanted to mention is Weld County has got great resources in terms of oil and gas, but we have 300 days of sunshine. We have more solar coming online with some industrial size solar facilities that will be permitted here in about the next year. And then finally, we have some wind generation up along the border with Wyoming on what's known as the Cheyenne Ridge. We feel that all three of those combined are important and they go into the mix. But oil and gas is a primary one that we've concentrated on with this permitting, and we feel very comfortable with it and look forward to working with the COGCC on coordinating better our permitting processes going forward.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Bruce. We'll look forward to you taking some questions after Dan speaks. And our third speaker is Professor Daniel Caffeine. And Dan is a professor in the Department of Economics and an Institute Fellow in the Renewable and Sustainable Energy Institute, or RACE, at the University of Colorado Boulder. He's currently an associate editor at Resource and Energy Economics, as well as European Economic Review, and serves on the editorial council for the Journal of the Association of Environmental and Resource Economists, as well as the Journal of Environmental Economics and Management. Recent and ongoing research projects of his examine the environmental effects of transportation policy, the impacts of the rapidly increasing role of wind power in the electricity sector, and the intersection of energy, environmental policy, and the role of property rights and institutions in natural resource use and conservation. So 3 very qualified speakers. And Dan, I think we'll roll it over to you before we take these great questions that are popping up from our audience.
Okay, great, thank you. So we've heard some great insights from the regulatory side of things and the legal side of things. And so I wanna sort of take a stab at talking through some of the economic side of things. And I mean economic, not just in terms of profit or business profits, but sort of the allocation of scarce resources more generally by society. And so I'll start by talking about supply and demand, both because they take away my economist card if I don't, but also because I think it's really useful to sort of frame the thinking about hydraulic fracturing and oil and gas activity more generally here in Colorado. So I think one important sort of takeaway to think about is that because Colorado is a relatively small player in the world economy, the demand for oil and gas products is national while the supply is local. So what that means is that oil and gas operators are by and large price takers. And so things that happen at the national level or at the international level drive the prices that oil and gas operators see, right? And so the things the forces that Amy and Tom and Mark brought up earlier on will in many ways shape the prices that are faced by operators here in the state. On the flip side of that is that there's many decisions and things going on at the local level that in turn affect the supply. So if you think about sort of prices and you think about supplies, the quantity of oil and gas activity and the quantity of fracking that occurs here in Colorado is going to be driven by the intersection of this national demand with the local supply. So on the national demand side or even international demand, there were a number of things that were brought up earlier that I think were important in terms of trends that are going to have an impact on oil and gas activity here in Colorado. And I'll just touch on a few things that maybe weren't brought up as much earlier on. So there was a lot of discussion about renewables in the electricity sector. And Mark touched on sort of the important role that gas has played in offsetting pollution from coal, for example. The share of renewables is growing. It's forecast to grow for the near future. In many ways, though, gas serves as a useful complement to wind and solar. Natural gas-fired electricity can ramp very quickly, and so as long as it's not frozen, I guess, as we've seen in Texas. But the ability of gas to follow the fluctuations in wind and intermittent wind and solar makes gas extremely useful as a backup. So at least in the near to medium term, it's possible that renewables and gas will have sort of a complementary relationship, even though in the long run, under deep decarbonization, for example, renewables and gas may be substitutes, and more renewables might crowd out natural gas activity. Another important trend nationally that I think is important is electrification, particularly for vehicles. Right, so there's a lot of move towards electric vehicles that will have some important impacts for the demand for oil and gas products. It's a bit nuanced. On the one hand, electrification is obviously not good for oil. That's going to reduce demand for oil. But to the extent that electricity has to be met, the electricity demands have to be met from somewhere. Some of that electricity demand may be met by natural gas. So you might see sort of a downward pressure on prices for oil, but upward pressure on prices for gas coming from electrification. And the other, I think, an important national trend is climate policy. And I think, in general, any climate policy that comes out of the new administration is likely to be bad news for oil and reduce oil demand. But again, the impacts on natural gas are nuanced. So for example, the Clean Power Plan that was around, let's say in 2016 and then disappeared, its impact on gas was pretty nuanced. And in fact, in many states, the Clean Power Plan would have served as a tax on coal and a small subsidy to natural gas fired generation. And so it's unclear what plans will be coming out of the new administration, but there's at least precedent for gas, somewhat surprisingly, to be getting subsidies out of these climate policies simply because gas-fired electricity is cleaner than coal. Okay, so those sort of national policy market trends and national policy decisions will have impacts on the prices that operators face. And then finally, of course, international factors matter as well. So COVID-19 has had a huge impact on demand for oil and gas products. I was looking at a time series of rig count and drilling operations, and they fall off a cliff in March 2020 as the COVID-19 pandemic kicked off. There's also other international factors include LNG exports. So there's a move to have more LNG, liquid natural gas exports to Japan, which creates a whole nother international market for gas products to play in. And then OPEC, Russia, and other international players at sort of the geopolitical realm can also have impacts on the prices that local operators face. On the local supply side, then, we've heard about factors that affect the local supply. So geology matters. So Weld County is the 800-pound gorilla in oil and gas production in the state, particularly oil. And that's driven by the Denver-Julesburg Basin and the particular geology there. It's also affected by technology. All right, so the topic here is hydraulic fracturing, but has been alluded to by many folks. Horizontal drilling is also extremely important, and maybe as important or more important in unlocking a lot of the oil and gas in the Denver-Julesburg area. So, for example, the city of Greeley, has lots of horizontal wells drilled underneath the city from wells that may be outside the city proper. So, and then the final thing are state and local policies. So we've heard a lot about various state and local policies from Julian, and then sort of how they play out in Weld County from Bruce. There are knobs that can be turned, or things like severance tax rates. So the tax rates that's placed on oil and gas, and so those vary across different states, and those will affect the amount of oil and gas activity in the state. The permitting and inspection process that both Julie and Bruce mentioned. So the process by which wells are approved and the various rules and regulations that they have to adhere by, and the inspection process of making sure that those rules are being followed. And then finally is setbacks. So this has been sort of the hot topic, I guess, in Proposition 112 was the proposition put forward to state voters, and then the recent rulemaking process by COGCC has you know, the rear 500-foot setbacks, and then proposed 2,500-foot setbacks, and now we're at 2,000-foot setbacks, I believe. So that question of sort of what should these setbacks look like? How far away from homes and other vulnerable structures should oil and gas operations be? Is sort of it's an important question and affects local supply. And so, you know, on these setbacks, the way I think these are important. This is an important policy here in Colorado, but is also under debate in California and a number of other states that are thinking about these oil and gas setbacks. So I think the way I think about them as an economist is that these are spatial policy tools that can balance the benefits of extraction that Bruce mentioned, so these local income and royalties and other things like that, against local health and safety concerns. But these are really sort of localized sort of land use decisions, where to put things type questions. And so the cost of these setbacks is, you know, of increasing the setback distances, to the extent there's foregone economic value from extraction, that there's resources that could have been accessed that are unable to be accessed because of the size of the setback. And the benefit is the reduced local exposure to potential health and safety concerns, right? So there's a sort of balancing between the cost of these things and in terms of foregone extraction, and then the benefit side of improved health and safety, okay? And so as an economist, we often think about sort of optimal policy design, or what's the right setback. So if you look across states, the range in these setbacks is enormous. Some states have setbacks as small as 100 feet. Maryland, I think, is 1,000 feet. Some states allow different municipalities to set their setbacks. And so, you know, the question of what's the right setback, I think, is an interesting one and a challenging one. I just a couple of points I guess to make on that is, you know, this ability to drill horizontally, which has been a big part of spurring this resource boom, has some interesting impacts in terms of thinking about setbacks. Back when wells had to be drilled vertically, the impact between what you can do on the surface and what's going on under the surface is very, very tightly coupled. And with horizontal drilling, you know, you can, where the surface impact occurs and where the subsurface resources are somewhat disconnected, or more disconnected. And so that might provide some actual justification for larger setbacks. You could imagine a world where you could drill a 100-mile lateral from, I don't know, somewhere in the middle of the Eastern Plains all the way to Weld County and put all the surface impacts way out there, right? We're not at that stage, but you can see how sort of the ability to drill sort of changes how we might think about these setbacks. The other thing to note is from an economic standpoint, economic broadly speaking, not profitable, but economics sort of encompassing both health and safety as well as profits and extraction benefits. The economically efficient setbacks balances not total cost and total benefit of the setback, but the marginal or incremental benefits of the setback, or the marginal incremental cost of the setback. In other words, what's it cost to push that setback back another 200 feet incrementally? And what are the benefits of moving it another 200 feet back incrementally? And so we as economists, we think of sort of trying to balance that on the margin in terms of the marginal benefits and the marginal costs. And I guess the final thing on the setbacks, and this is sort of motivated by just some of the public debate about this, is that I think setbacks are well suited to address these local issues, these trade-offs between local economic returns against sort of health and safety concerns. But I think they're not well suited to addressing some of the broader concerns such as climate change or energy security. There are other policies in our policy toolbox that are better suited to think about climate change and greenhouse gas emissions and energy security. Whereas I think these setbacks are really speak to these local issues of getting at sort of what are the local impacts, both positive and negative, and how can we balance those? So with that, I think I'll kick it back to Suzanne.
Great, thank you. That's great. We received some questions before this panel and have a number of questions that we've received just now with our Colorado panel here. And some of the questions have been about exactly kind of what you ended on there, Dan, about potential health and safety concerns and setbacks, and questions about equity, where wells are sited. And I know, Bruce, you mentioned that there are those public hearings and people are wondering about those and kind of the stakeholder engagement. and whether the notices go out to, you know, how those notices go out, whether they're in different languages other than just English, and whether they are, you know, convenient times for working parents and things like that with the hearing. So you might all three, I don't know, want to address the kind of health and safety concerns and really engagement with the community about the siting before it happens and kind of that process.
Sure, I guess I can start. I think that community engagement is highly important, and it's something that we stress as being something, it should start before the application actually comes in to Weld County. The having that dialogue, if the dialogue is happening correctly, if there is a language barrier, the operator is going to know about that. And that's something that actually the county government is not going to know, but the operator will have that understanding. That's something that we make certain, or want to make certain, that the operators do have the ability to go out, and they need an interpreter to be there with them. They do that, and they let us know if that's important or necessary for our notices that go out, and also for the hearing itself. So it's an important part of it. But the notice that we're sending goes out to not just the building occupants, it goes out to property owners, and we're noticing to 2,000 feet away from the location to the nearest to the property line itself. And that includes tenants who may be in buildings that are on those properties. So we want to make certain that we notify everyone who may be impacted.
If I, yeah, I think that that's a great overview, Bruce. And in complement to that, OGCC, I would offer two things. One, we have now set out an expectation that notices be provided in languages appropriate, I guess, for like a less artful way of putting it. And the other place where, you know, OGCC is, I think, learning better how to communicate early and engage appropriately. If you look again at the history of oil and gas conservation commissions, they were focused entirely on the downhole. And as Dan alluded to, that connection between the surface and the reservoir was so tight that there wasn't the opportunity to look at alternative locations. One of the important components of our new rules is the requirement to look at alternative locations for a proposed facility to understand what of these different options is quote unquote the best. And in that space and in that early conversation, I think it's really important for OGCC to partner with communities like Weld County who have developed their own process and align those processes so that communities are having the same conversation at the same time, and we don't double down on efforts, and, you know, create consistent pathways to engagement. And that's where I think that at least my staff and Bruce's staff are starting to really work better together in that early planning space. And I'm really grateful for that opportunity. So.
Thank you. And did you want to touch on it at all, or? Okay.
I guess one thing I'd say, I mean, the one other aspect of community on the community side, I guess, is that there is a complaint process, right, by which people who live near wells can submit complaints to COGCC. Julie probably knows heck of a lot more about this than I do, but I've done some work on this, on looking at these complaints and looking at the follow-up inspections and corrective actions that regulators issue to wells. And we actually looked at some cuts along, for example, are these complaints or is the inspection process different depending on the race or the ethnicity or the language of the census block from where the well exists. So in other words, is it the case that folks aren't complaining or they're complaining more? So either way, we didn't find much evidence of a distinction there. So the complaints didn't seem to come more or less from different types of communities. Although there is some evidence, for example, in Texas that in the mineral leasing process and the royalty process for landowners that ESL, English second language folks get worse deals from oil and gas companies than native English speakers. And so there's some concerns there about equity and other issues across different communities. But at least from what I've seen in the complaint side of the things, it doesn't seem to be a strong difference across those different communities.
And that's for landowner payments or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Royalty payments.
Okay. Another question we're hearing, we've got a couple of different questions on this, is about the financial assurances. And I know, Julie, you said you weren't going to talk about it too much, and maybe there's no timeline right now, but there's a quote from a 2019 COGCC report that said Colorado's existing two-tiered bonding structure allows many operators with hundreds and sometimes thousands of wells to maintain less than $1,000 of financial assurance per well. And so it seems like that's something that will be addressed in the future.
That's a great segue to yes is the short answer. And the conversation around financial assurance has been going on for a couple of years. The priority of rulemaking topics given to us by the legislature put this to me as a second tier rulemaking, but that means it's on the cusp of being undertaken this summer, I believe, by our commissioners. We've just opened an informational docket to solicit input from a number of other folks, but there has been a lot of work that's gone into this topic, and this is certainly like a nationwide question of what is the appropriate financial assurance and how do we structure it. And I really look forward to the stakeholder engagement in this space.
Great, thank you. I mean, I'm assuming you would look at other states and what they've done, and then, depending on what we do in Colorado, other states will look to us as well in the future.
Yep.
Okay, so I know, Bruce, you mentioned when the operators come in that they have been, even though they're not obligated to, they've been great about certain community communication and engagement. There's a question about requirement of large fleets of heavy vehicles that stress the infrastructure. And the question is, are the costs covered through fees or taxes, or is this just one of the incentives for the operators?
Yeah, they are in a variety of different ways. One is our permitting itself. As I mentioned, we require either an improvements agreement and or maintenance agreement. So it's one or both. So we're requiring the operators to actually assist us in maintaining those roadways that are taking a pretty big impact. We also require them to do traffic studies and make certain that they bring their traffic in a manner to the place, in a manner that is least impactful on the neighborhood. So that's one way. We also have an impact. It's like a transport fee. So when they're moving the rig from one spot to another, we have a transport fee that we charge them for that move. And then finally is that working relationship with the operators, where we meet with them on a monthly basis to make certain that they're the ones who get out and actually fix those roadways that need assistance. If we know they're going to be going in one direction or another, and our public works staff knows that this route or that route is going to be a problem, we ask them to go in and make certain improvements to be able to get their trucks over those roadways better. It's safer for them, safer for the public.
Great, thank you. Next one.
I wanted to raise a question.
Yeah.
One last point there about the traffic impacts and accidents. So this has been something that there's been some recent academic work looking at the impact of trucks on accidents. And one of the, I think, somewhat surprising results, or I don't know, not the first thing I would have thought of, is that more trucks does mean more truck-car collisions, just sort of an expectation, but it also means more car-on-car collisions. And that was something that I was a little surprised to see. I suspect it's from people trying to drive around heavy trucks or something along those lines. But there's a we call an accident externality associated with these trucks of sort of increasing the probability of collisions. And so that's something that folks have looked at in terms of insurance claims and accident data associated with additional trucks on the road.
Wow, thank you. And I know you mentioned kind of the electrification of vehicles and of buildings. And this is kind of maybe a broader question, but are there plans in place in Colorado to help oil and gas workers and their communities if there is this transition to electrification, so away from oil and gas?
I may start on that. I don't know of a formal conversation in that space. And I think one of the hardest things in this conversation goes back to the points that Dan was making in particular, that where we source oil and gas resources and how we source our electrons, for lack of a better term, can be different. And so even if this is a global commodity, and so even if Colorado as a state chooses to be entirely on a grid system for electricity that comes from non-carbon sources, that doesn't mean there isn't a demand for Colorado's oil and gas. And so we need to understand, and again, I hate to just keep citing back to what Dan said, but he said it well, in that there are other policy tools at play, right? Like my role as a regulator is to look at oil and gas development and make sure it complies with our act and rules. These bigger picture components of what we source and how and where are part of a bigger conversation. And that's a really long-winded way to get back to the fundamental question of, are there pieces in place to address displaced oil and gas workers? Not that I know of today, and until we know what that looks like, we may not need it, right? And as we continue to be more protective in the way that we develop oil and gas resources, it challenges the fundamental question, or the fundamental premise of the question, in that we will move away from it. It's a really complicated area in my mind, and I've kind of meandered around a bunch of points on it. So Bruce, you might want to back clean up for me.
One thing about the oil and gas industry, and as long as I've been county attorney, which is a long time, I've seen a lot of ups and downs in the cycle. And, in those times when the prices are low, you get a lot of people who are out of work. And a lot of them just say, I'm done with the oil and gas industry. And they move on to other professions, other industries. When the price goes back up, you see a lot of people getting back into it, and a lot of new people who maybe in years to come, when the price goes back down, maybe there's a crash of the prices, they'll be saying, I'm done with this industry. So, it's not like it's just this hasn't happened before. It's the type of thing where with this industry, I think it happens on fairly frequent cycles, where people come into the industry and get out of the industry, dependent upon their personal circumstances. So, to that extent, there's a big stress in Weld County on community colleges. And that is one of the reasons why the Board of County Commissioners created what's known as Bright Futures, which is an endowment that is funded for the purposes of assisting people with tuition payments at community colleges. We now have about, I think it's around $90 million in that foundation. So it provides good money for that, but also it's an understanding that the industry, oil and gas industry, one of our main industries, is up and down. And that is something that people call on those community colleges for training in other areas.
Yeah, this is something that I think we're seeing across the country. When Max did my introduction, he mentioned that I've been studying the coal transition, and we in Colorado have the Office of Just Transition in our Department of Labor. And So it is a boom and bust cycle kind of industry, and I think you're right. I think people are used to the ups and downs, and yet it does also seem like when an industry is really in decline, as the coal industry is now, the government can step in and make sure that we're not leaving behind the workers who have for so long supplied us with reliable electricity, reliable energy over decades. But yeah, it's another boom and bust industry.
And
Yeah,
Suzanne,
I might also mention that just the past 2 days, Vestas, which makes blades for wind turbines here in Weld County, closed one of its plants because of lack of demand. That's 450 people out of work. I mean, it's happens in other industries too.
It does, and it's definitely happened in forestry and textiles, and I think Vestas said they were moving to the maintenance and the technicians. They were going to increase their staff in those areas, more in the operations and maintenance, and less in the production of the manufacturing. So, yeah. And Julie, you were going to say something?
yeah, I have heard this conversation of how should we be looking at the Office of Just Transition, and should it intersect with oil and gas workers in particular, and how that should or shouldn't play out. And I think it's a ripe opportunity for the conversation. It's complicated, and I guess I just want to kind of put my blinders on to some degree and focus on what our programs in fact are.
Yeah.
Recognizing that there's a bigger suite of folks who need to talk about that particular issue.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay, great. Well, I want to turn this back over to Max and Matt, but thank you so much, Julie and Dan and Bruce. This has been great, really interesting conversation. And again, we haven't gotten to all of the questions, but I think Michaela will follow up with people. So thank you for sharing your expertise with us today.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank
Thanks
you.
so much, Suzanne. Thank you, Julie, Bruce, and Dan. And I'm actually going to pass it over to Michaela.
Hi, everyone. I'm Michaela Blanton. I'm the Special Projects Director for the Colorado Local Science Engagement Network. Well, I just want to start by saying thank you to our panelists. Thank you to Christine and Suzanne for moderating the discussion. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. I hope that the discussion was as educational and as insightful for you all as it was for me. So as Max mentioned at the beginning of today's event, we aim to bring science to bear on policy decisions and build and foster a new contingent of scientists in Colorado who can be brought into the policy realm. Today's event sought to kickstart this work by connecting scientists, decision makers, and community members around a really important policy topic, but we know that there's still a lot to do to realize our objectives long term. So with that in mind, I invite you all to visit the AAAS and Colorado Local Science Engagement Network's websites to learn more about how you can sign up and get involved. I also like to encourage you to keep an eye out for some other projects and events that our team is working on. So we are regularly posting science notes to our website that share up-to-date information about timely science and policy issues in Colorado. And we are on the lookout for science guest contributors if you're interested. We have a new communications director, Kayla Zacharias, who is leading this work and helping to build relationships, develop a newsletter, and more. And we are also developing a Better Know a District project that will highlight science policy society issues in each of the 7 districts of Colorado. Our new activation and recruitment director, Sophie Mangasarian, is mapping the Colorado science policy community and is also compiling a library of important resources to share on our website. Finally, we are planning a mid-April legislative event where community members, scientists, and legislators can workshop some current science policy issues in our state. All of this work is being supported by our very enthusiastic and talented intern, Presley Church. So please be sure to sign up on our website so that you can stay in the know about our future work and events. Thanks again, everyone, and I'll now hand it back to Max for some final reflections.
Thank you very much, Michaela. So thank you all for joining us. I know we're right at time. Just again, want to thank the Colorado Local Science Engagement Network team. As Michaela had just mentioned, Kayla Zacharias, Sophie Mangasarian, Presley Church, Michaela Blanton, and Matt Druckenmiller. I want to thank the advisory group that we have that includes Colorado State Senator Kerry Donovan, as well as Colorado State Senator Ray Scott, along with Benet Duncan from Western Water Assessment, Lisbeth Finseth from CU Denver, CU Anschutz, Chelsea Nagy from the Earth Lab, Dan Powers from CoLabs, Patty Romero-Lancao from the University of Chicago, Kirsten Schuckman from the CU Office of Government Affairs, Heidi Steltzer from Fort Lewis College, and Khadija Thiero from Significant Opportunities in Atmospheric Research and Science, or SOARS, at UCAR. And of course, our advisory group members, Suzanne Tegen at Center for New Energy Economy, and Christine Wiedinmyer and Ceres, who were our facilitators today. Just a final thanks and mention to our sponsors and partners: Ceres, the Cooperative Institute for Research in Environmental Sciences, the Media and Climate Change Observatory at CU, the Institute for Science and Policy at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, and Epicenter through AAAS, the Center for Scientific Evidence in Public Issues. We appreciate you all again hanging on here a little bit past our 2-hour block. We will have this recorded and posted up on our website for future viewing. There is so much rich content that you may want to watch it at least twice. And for those of you who watched it start to finish, you now know the definitive answer about the future of hydraulic fracturing. I'm just kidding about that. There's still a lot of work to do, but thank you for your engagement today. Goodbye, everyone.